Welcome back. In our last lesson, we of course did this crazy example where we are spinning some tacos using selection, the all-important pattern of selection in our JavaScript file, as well as adding a CSS animation and using an event listener to listen for the click event on this taco button, which is causing the class spin to be added and removed. And at this point, that is working great. However, in this lesson, we're going to focus a little bit more on these listener events and talk a little bit about how they function. We're also going to learn how we can add a keyboard listener to this event to sort of perform actions on different sort of events that may occur on a particular HTML element. And we'll get started by taking a little bit of a deeper look at this click event listener, because I think that's just such an important part of all web interactions is this idea of click. And as you can see in our JavaScript, this is the button click listener that we created in the last lesson. So we're selecting a reference to our taco button HTML element. And then of course, we're adding an event listener to the click listener. And then we are using our previously selected instance of that HTML element to modify its class list, which is using the toggle method to add and remove the spin class. Pretty simple, pretty easy. But let's see what happens if we were to go into our HTML file. And let's just say, for example, that maybe these buttons right here, maybe for whatever reason, they were wrapped inside of a form tag. Maybe these buttons are actually showing up inside of a web form or a registration form or something like that within our web application. And as soon as you add this form tag, it's going to change the default behavior of an HTML button element. And I'll show you here what's going to happen is now that we've made that change, when I click on the taco button, you may see it start to spin for just a moment, but then the page is actually refreshing. And that's because anytime you have a button inside of a form tag, the default behavior is that the browser, in this case Google Chrome, is saying, hey, we have a button inside of a form. That's probably a submit button. So what it's actually doing is it's trying to submit the form. And we absolutely don't want that in this case. We are adding a taco spinner and we want our tacos to spin when you click the button, right? So we need to kind of disable that default behavior and prevent it from happening in the first place. And in order to do that, inside of our JavaScript, we're going to have to change our arrow function that we're currently using to toggle our class just a bit so that we can access what's called the event that actually occurs on click. And the way we can do that is you can either just add like EV, or you can call the parameter whatever you want. You can call it event, or I usually just call it E for short because we use that so often. But you'll notice in the IntelliSense here, if I just type this in, you'll see in this case, your listener accepts a single parameter called EV, which is of type mouse event. So you can actually add that parameter in here, and then now within this arrow function that we've created, I could just, for example, say console.log E if we want to kind of take a look and see what that looks like. Just a note too, when you have your arrow functions and you have a single parameter, shorthand is you don't need the parentheses. If you have more than one parameter up there, you do need parentheses. But normally, if I'm just doing a simple click listener, there's only one possible parameter there, so we'll just remove the parentheses in this case to clean it up a bit. And for this to work, we're also going to have to go into our index.html, and let's just take this form out for now. And I'll go ahead and save that so that our page doesn't reload every time we click on the button, so we can actually use this console.log. And now if we jump over here, let me clear the console to just clean this up a bit. Whenever we click on the button, you'll notice that it is logging this mouse event. And this is something you can capture on all of your event listeners. And depending on what type of event you are capturing or listening for, it's going to have different sort of data inside of this. In this case, it's a mouse event, but you also have keyboard events and all sorts of other events that could occur on different HTML elements. And this contains a lot of important data, especially as we get a little further down and are creating some more advanced interactions later on in the course. You're definitely going to want to be familiar with these events that you can capture as a parameter inside of your listeners. So let's just open this up and we'll kind of take a look at some of the sort of data you're going to see. You certainly don't have to memorize this because it's always available. You could always log it out and take a look at it. But there's lots of important information that you could potentially use depending on what your interaction is doing. So for example, you can see whether or not the Alt key is held down whenever that click is actually made. You get information about which button was actually clicked. And if you scroll down further, you get lots of positioning information, especially on mouse events, because the cursor position is really important in certain interactions, like drag and drop and touch events and stuff like that. So you can see client X and client Y. There's also layer X and layer Y down here, and you just have all kinds of stuff. Offsets, page X, page Y, screen X, screen Y, just all kinds of different measurements that you may need to use in different scenarios for measuring mouse movement or measuring distance between something, and just all sorts of reasons you may want to use that. But there's just a ton of stuff that's really, really useful here. In particular, one we're going to use quite a lot is the target. So this is a property on the mouse event that occurs that basically tells you what you clicked on. And event.target in this case is the button with an ID of taco button, so it's the button itself, but that changes based on what you click on. So for example, if I click on the center of the button, let me clear the console again, click on the center of the button, what did I actually click on? Well, I clicked on the button, but more specifically, if you look at the target, I clicked on the span with a class of taco that's inside the button, because again, we have this relationship of HTML elements, and our event target in this case, because I clicked in the center of the button on the taco itself, the event target in this case was the span. But what happened was our click event bubbled up to the button, which then fired its click event. So you kind of have this idea of events bubbling up to parent elements that actually have their click listener on it. So I can click on a child of the button or on the button itself, and it's going to do the same event either way. And you'll even see there's that property bubbles true. So that event is bubbling up. So all sorts of things inside of these mouse events, and we're going to get a little more deep into that as we get more advanced in the course. But for now, let's go ahead and we're going to use one aspect of this event, this mouse event that we can capture to prevent, let's go back to our form here. So now we're back to a situation where when we click, the page is reloading and it's not spinning the taco. And we can now fix that now that we've added our event parameter here, because I can do a prevent default click. And that just looks like this, e.prevent default. That's all you have to do. So if you want to prevent the default behavior of a keyboard event or a mouse event from occurring, you capture this parameter and you say e.prevent default, and that's going to just say whatever you were going to do whenever we clicked on this or whenever you hit the key or whatever that event may be, then just don't do it. And we're going to do our custom function down here instead. And then so down here, of course, we'll spin that taco and kind of go back to normal and do our normal functionality. But now you'll see, even though I'm inside of a form here, whenever we click on it, because we're preventing default, it's going to work, because it's going to say, hey, don't submit the form. We're preventing the default action from occurring. And that's going to continue to allow our button to function. So in general, you do want to do this, especially on click events, because there may be times when you're updating something that has a default click event and you just need that to not occur. So in general, we are going to do that on most of our events, but there's certainly scenarios where you don't want to prevent the default, or you may want to check some Boolean value before you actually prevent default to make sure you're not preventing something that the user is trying to do. Cool. So that looks pretty good. We've improved this just a bit by adding our event default, event.prevent default. But now let's take a look at how a keyboard event differs from a click event or a mouse event. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add a second event listener down here, and we're going to say button key listener, and we'll say taco button dot add event listener, and then we'll use the key down event. So this is a different event type that we're going to use, but we're going to kind of use it in the same fashion we did up above. We are going to prevent default key down, and then let me just show you this as a word of caution. And this is dangerous, right? You don't want to prevent all key down events from occurring, because you'll see what happens now that we've added that event.prevent default. That's hard to say. Event.prevent We'll just call it e.prevent default. That's much easier. But now that we've added that, normally you can use keyboard shortcuts to do all sorts of things. You can use your arrows to scroll up and down. You can use the space key to scroll one page at a time. You can use the backspace key to go backwards in your history. There's lots of keyboard shortcuts that people might be accustomed to using whenever they're using a web application on a keyboard-enabled device. And for example, I can normally hit Command R on Mac or Control R on Windows to refresh the page, and you'll see a little bit of a flash as I do that each time. But now that we've prevented the default key down event on the taco button, we're actually preventing all key down events, which means that as soon as our taco button has focus, and that means if I hit the tab key, you'll see I've changed my focus to the taco button. If I hit Command R, it doesn't do anything. If I hit space or up or down or escape or whatever, even if I try to hit tab to the next element, it doesn't do anything because I have broken the keyboard basically by as soon as the taco button gets focus, I'm preventing the default keyboard key down event from occurring. So don't do this. Definitely don't disable all keyboard support. That's a really bad idea. What you want to do is you want to kind of do a check first to say, did you press the key that I care about? Because I only want to prevent the default action from occurring when you press a certain key. And what we can do is we can take this out, and just like we did before, let's just console.log e so we can take a look at this event that occurs on the taco button, and we'll see what we can use inside of that keyboard event in this case. You'll see here, if you hover over this, it's actually a keyboard event type, which is a little bit different from a mouse event, but very similar. And you'll see as we log this now, let's clear our console here. And if I hit my keyboard right now, it doesn't log anything because these keyboard listeners only get fired whenever the selected HTML element that you're adding a listener to has keyboard focus, right? So I have to hit the tab key to actually give it focus. And now when I hit the F key on my keyboard, for example, you can see it fires off this keyboard event. So those key down events only occur whenever the HTML element has keyboard focus. And that's especially important to consider for accessibility purposes, which we'll talk about in a later lesson more in depth. But now that this element has focus, every time we hit a key, if I hit the T key or the K key or whatever, it's going to fire off a new keyboard event because we have hooked up our key down event listener. And let's just drill into one of these to kind of see how it's similar to a mouse event, but also kind of different. So you still get a lot of the same things you had before. You have the Alt key, the bubbles, Control key, all kinds of stuff. But you also, of course, get this code. So this is very useful. If you want to check to see what key you actually press, you'll get this event.code, which in this case contains key K. Also, there's event.key, which is just simply K. So that's a nice one to use as well because you can actually use that to differentiate between holding down the Shift key and hitting uppercase K or just hitting K and doing lowercase k in this case, because you'll see here if I change my focus and I hit Shift K, you'll see the key in that case is just an uppercase K. And it actually even fired off an event for Shift Left in that case. So all of these things, these codes, including key code, this was something that is now actually officially deprecated. So it used to be that we always checked for a keyboard key using a key code, but now they kind of recommend we use this .key or .code to kind of check what key you have pressed. There's also meta key here. That's kind of an important one. If I think on Windows, that's the Windows key. On Mac, it's Command. On Windows, that might be Control. I don't really remember how the meta key works, but I'm pretty sure that's the Windows key itself on Windows. But anyway, all kinds of stuff here that you can utilize. And just like a click event, we also have a target in this case. So the target is whatever has focus whenever you press that key. So just like a mouse event has a click target, a keyboard event has a focus target that you can use to determine which element actually has focus whenever that keyboard event is fired off. So before we go forward, let me just show you this really cool website created by Wes Boss. It's called keycode.info. You can find a link to that in the video description down below, or just go to keycode.info. I'd recommend bookmarking that. It's really cool because basically you can just hit a key and it gives you all sorts of information on exactly this sort of thing. It actually gives you information about the keyboard event that is fired off, including event.key, event.which, which is the key code, and event.code, which is key K in this case, and also the actual key code itself, which again is a deprecated thing. So this one's pretty weird, to be honest, in terms of determining which key you press in terms of browser compatibility, because it's kind of in the process of changing. So I'm going to show you kind of a couple different ways to do it, and you can choose what works best for you. But what I mean by that is kind of the traditional way we always did this is we used event.keycode, which is a numeric number, as you can see here. But there's all these other ways to determine which key you press too. You can do event.key, event.which, event.code, and they all do the same thing as well. But the problem is if you look up keyboard event.keycode, which is the way we used to do it, it's officially deprecated. So eventually that support may fall off of browsers. I doubt that will happen anytime soon. But this is the most well-supported method across all older browsers. So if you're developing an application that maybe needs to support like 4 or 5 versions back, you may find yourself having to use event.keycode. But because it's officially deprecated, I don't want to teach you guys like the old way to do this. But I always like to use caniuse.com. This is a really good website to check for browser compatibility. It's pretty awesome to keep this bookmarked. But basically, I can search for event.key, which is one of the new ways to do it. But you'll see it's kind of got spotty support a little bit. It works for the most part in recent versions of Chrome, and it works across all modern desktop browsers, but it's a little spotty on like Android, and even there's some weird use cases like Edge use cases and Edge and Internet Explorer as usual. Thanks, Microsoft, that you might run into. And on the other hand, if you scroll down and take a look at a keyboard event.keycode, it's just supported across all browsers. So it's a little bit weird because we have this deprecated method of checking the event key code that is supported everywhere. And then you have this new recommended method of using the .key that isn't supported everywhere. But you don't want to use the deprecated method that's supported everywhere. So it's just a little bit weird. So we need to work around that. The good news is there is a polyfill for this .key that's pretty easy to add. So if you want to just program it using the modern way, you could certainly configure your Babel or your Parcel build process to kind of do polyfills. That's one of the things under the hood in Parcel in our solution is it uses Babel to like transpile our code. So your JavaScript can actually run through a build process, and it can automatically do things like add polyfills or change your ES6 down to older JavaScript versions and kind of do all this fancy stuff. So one of the things you can configure it to do is to add polyfills, which might be a good use case in this case if you need to support some of these older browsers, but you still want to use the latest supported .key method. So that's going to be kind of how we're going to do it. And here we're going to use .key whenever we check for keys. I'll kind of point out any dodgy support as we go through this course because there's a lot, the web changes so often. I want to teach you the latest and greatest stuff, but I also want you to be aware of when that won't work because that's important too. So we'll use event.key, but there is a polyfill available for that. If you're going to build for production, you may want to drop that in. So we'll go back here and let's go ahead and wire up our event listener now that we know how to check for the event.key or the e.key before we prevent default. What we can do is say when you press the T key, for example, or we can even make that lowercase t. If e.key is equal to T, then do something. Right? And generally with your keyboard, your key down listeners, because so much could occur on key down, you want to use if statements or switch statements or something to kind of say only do something custom if we're pressing the key that we're interested in. So in this case, if event.key is equal to T, then we can prevent default key down, e.prevent default, like so. And then do something, right? Like spin that taco. In this case, we'll just console.log e to just test that this works. But now that we've added this key down event, and when we've placed the prevent default inside of an if statement. Now I can clear the console, change my keyboard focus to the taco button, but I can press tab again, and I haven't disabled our navigation. I can press up and down. I can press all kinds of stuff on my keyboard. Everything's going to work just fine. I can refresh. But if I press the T key, I'm going to fire that keyboard event. So we're kind of basically saying we don't care what happens when you do a key down unless you press the T key in this case, which is important. So now that we've done that, we can spin that taco. And one of the things you can do with your HTML elements is you can do taco button dot click. So this actually it's like invoking a click. It's like pretending that the user actually clicked on the button. So rather than writing whatever logic we have again that's up here in the click event, we can just kind of invoke a click. And then if we had a whole bunch of stuff going on and click on this taco button, it's just going to do all the same stuff because all we're doing is just kind of reusing that method up there. And now that we have done that, let's go back into our application. We'll change our keyboard focus to the taco button, and we will press the T key on our keyboard, which will, of course, spin that taco. So that's pretty cool. We wired up not only a click, but also a keyboard event to do the same thing on our particular button. So this is a good example of how you can use the event.target, the event. All kinds of stuff, use mouse events and keyboard events to get all sorts of different information on your event listeners that you've created, and also how to properly handle a key down event so that you're not breaking the application for keyboard users and for accessibility purposes. And I think that's a really important thing to just keep in mind and make sure you're doing when you're building your own web interactions. In the next lesson, we are going to continue to work on our taco spinner application because it's so awesome and we love working with it, right? So we're going to continue to improve this and add some even more complex and better stuff to this so we can keep learning about these basics of web interaction as we're creating these switch sort of interaction components inside of this app. So stay tuned and we'll get started with that in just a moment.